Marine service dog starts acting strange around pregnant wife. What happens next leaves doctors stunned. Jake Martinez never expected his service dog Atlas to be wrong, not even once. The highly trained German Shepherd had saved his life countless times in Afghanistan and helped him battle PTSD after returning home. But now Atlas was acting bizarre around Sarah, Jake's pregnant wife, and his unusual behavior would soon reveal something that would leave the entire medical community in disbelief. It started on a crisp autumn morning when Sarah was just entering her second trimester. Jake noticed Atlas pacing anxiously around their bedroom, whining softly as Sarah got dressed for work. At first, he dismissed it as the dog being overprotective. Atlas had always been fond of Sarah, treating her like a precious member of his pack. But this was different. The dog's behavior wasn't just protective, it was almost desperate. Atlas, settle, Jake commanded, using the firm tone that usually worked instantly. But for the first time since his intensive service dog training, Atlas ignored the command. Instead, he planted himself firmly beside Sarah, pressing his body against her legs and looking up at her with worried eyes. Sarah laughed it off, running her fingers through Atlas's thick fur. "He's probably just excited about the baby," she said, patting her small bump. "Dogs can sense these things, right?" Jake wanted to believe it was that simple, but something in his gut told him otherwise. During his tours in Afghanistan, he'd learned to trust Atlas's instincts implicitly. The dog had detected hidden IEDs, warned of approaching threats, and even anticipated Jake's panic attacks before they hit. Atlas's judgment had never been wrong, not even once. As the days passed, Atlas's behavior became increasingly peculiar. He refused to leave Sarah's side, even to eat. When she sat on the couch, he would press his nose against her belly, sniffing intensely and whimpering. At night, they'd find him sleeping right outside their bedroom door, as if standing guard. The breaking point came during Sarah's routine prenatal checkup. Jake had to practically drag Atlas into the waiting room, something completely out of character for the usually composed service dog. The moment Dr. Thompson called them in, Atlas began trembling, his eyes fixed on Sarah with an intensity that made even the experienced physician pause. "I've never seen a service dog act quite like this," Dr. Thompson remarked, watching Atlas pace between Sarah and the examination table. "How long has this been going on?" "About 2 weeks now," Jake replied, his military training kicking in as he detailed Atlas's strange behavior. As he spoke, he could feel his anxiety rising. What if Atlas sensed something wrong with the baby? The dog's behavior was eerily similar to how he acted around IEDs, alert, focused, and unwavering in his conviction that something needed attention. Dr. Thompson listened intently, her expression growing more serious with each detail. She had been treating veterans and working with service dogs for over 20 years, but something about this situation felt different. "Let's do an extra thorough checkup today," she decided, reaching for her equipment. As the doctor began her examination, Atlas's behavior intensified. He stood up, placing his paws carefully on the edge of the examination table, his nose twitching as he sniffed the air around Sarah. His ears were pricked forward, and his entire body was rigid with concentration. Jake watched, his heart pounding. He'd seen this exact posture before, in Afghanistan, when Atlas had detected something crucial that human senses couldn't perceive. The memory made his pulse race faster. Dr. Thompson paused, looking from Atlas to her instruments, then back to Sarah. Her brow furrowed as she moved her stethoscope to different positions on Sarah's belly. The silence in the room grew heavy, broken only by Atlas's soft whining. "I'm picking up something unusual," Dr. Thompson finally said, her voice careful and measured. "I'd like to do an immediate ultrasound." Sarah reached for Jake's hand, squeezing it tight. The fear in her eyes matched the knot forming in his stomach. As they waited for the ultrasound machine to be brought in, Atlas remained vigilant, his behavior becoming increasingly agitated. Jake felt like he was back in Afghanistan, waiting for Atlas to indicate the location of a hidden threat. Only this time, the threat wasn't to him. It was to his wife and unborn child. The weight of uncertainty pressed down on him like a physical force, and he found himself unconsciously running through the breathing exercises his therapist had taught him for managing PTSD. As Dr. Thompson prepared the ultrasound gel, Atlas's whining grew louder, more insistent. The dog's eyes never left Sarah's belly, and his usual calm demeanor had been replaced by an urgency that sent chills down Jake's spine. Whatever Atlas had detected, they were about to find out exactly what it was, and the discovery would challenge everything the medical community thought they knew about pregnancy complications. The ultrasound room was eerily quiet except for the steady hum of machinery and Atlas's continuous whining. Dr. Thompson moved the probe across Sarah's belly, her eyes fixed intently on the monitor. Jake held his breath, his years of military training doing little to calm his racing heart as he waited for answers. Suddenly, Dr. Thompson's hand froze. Her eyes widened, and she leaned closer to the screen, adjusting several settings on the machine. "This is remarkable," she whispered, more to herself than to her patients. Atlas's whining grew louder, and he pressed his nose against the side of the examination table, exactly where the doctor had paused with the probe. "What is it?" Sarah's voice trembled, her fingers tightening around Jake's hand. "Is something wrong with our baby?" Dr. Thompson shook her head slowly, still staring at the screen. "Not wrong exactly, but I'm seeing something I've never encountered before in my 20 years of practice. Your baby, there's an unusual growth near the heart." Jake felt his world tilt sideways, memories of losing buddies in Afghanistan threatening to overwhelm him. But Atlas's familiar weight against his leg anchored him to the present, just as the dog had been trained to do. "A growth?" he managed to ask, his voice hoarse. Is it cancer?" "No," Dr. Thompson replied quickly, her voice taking on a tone of amazement. "It's actually a rare type of heart condition called an intrapericardial teratoma. It's a benign tumor that, if left undetected, could cause serious complications during birth. But here's the extraordinary thing. We've caught it at exactly the right time for fetal surgery, when most cases aren't discovered until it's too late." Sarah let out a sob of relief and Jake pulled her close, feeling tears stinging his own eyes. Atlas immediately moved to press against both of them, his tail wagging slowly as if sensing the shift in emotion. "But how did Atlas know?" Sarah asked, running her fingers through the dog's fur. "He's been trying to tell us something was wrong for weeks." Dr. Thompson smiled, finally setting down the ultrasound probe. "Service dogs are extraordinary animals, but this goes beyond anything I've ever encountered in medical literature. Somehow, Atlas detected this condition long before our standard tests would have caught it. The human body produces subtle chemical changes when something's wrong, but to detect something this specific, this early..." She shook her head in wonder. "Your dog may have just made medical history." Jake wasn't surprised. He remembered the countless times Atlas had detected IEDs that even the most sophisticated equipment had missed, how the dog had sensed incoming attacks before any human could. "Atlas has always been one step ahead," he said proudly, scratching behind his dog's ears. "He's never been wrong about a threat." The next few hours passed in a blur of consultations and phone calls. Dr. Thompson reached out to specialists at the nearby university hospital, sending them the ultrasound images and explaining the unprecedented way the condition had been detected. By the end of the day, Sarah was scheduled for groundbreaking fetal surgery with one of the top pediatric cardiac surgeons in the country. That evening, as Jake and Sarah sat on their front porch trying to process everything that had happened, Atlas lay at their feet, finally relaxed for the first time in weeks. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of pink and gold, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of blooming jasmine from their garden. "You know," Sarah said softly, her hand resting on her belly, "when you first came home with Atlas, I thought he was just going to help you with your PTSD. I never imagined he'd end up saving our baby's life." So Jake smiled, remembering the day he'd been paired with Atlas at the service dog training center. The trainer had told him that Atlas was special, even by service dog standards. "He's always been more than just a service dog," Jake replied, watching as Atlas lifted his head at the sound of his name. "He's family." As if understanding, Atlas stood up and gently placed his head on Sarah's lap, his eyes fixed on her belly. This time, his gaze wasn't filled with worry, but with the same steady, protective love they'd come to know so well. Sarah laughed softly, wiping away tears. "You knew all along, didn't you, boy? You were trying so hard to tell us." Atlas wagged his tail, and for a moment, Jake could have sworn the dog looked proud. The evening turned to night, and as the first stars appeared in the sky, Jake felt a profound sense of gratitude wash over him. Atlas had saved his life countless times in Afghanistan, helped him rebuild it when he returned home broken and haunted by war, and now the extraordinary dog had saved his unborn child. Tomorrow would bring challenges, hospitals, surgeons, and procedures. But tonight, in this moment, Jake knew with absolute certainty that everything would be okay. Atlas had never been wrong before, and the steady, peaceful look in his eyes told Jake that this time would be no different. The morning of Sarah's surgery arrived with a soft drizzle that reminded Jake of his first day back from Afghanistan. Just like then, Atlas walked close beside him, a steady presence in an uncertain world. The hospital had made special arrangements to allow Atlas to accompany them up until the pre-op area, a rare exception made after Dr. Thompson had passionately argued for his presence, citing his extraordinary detection of the condition. "I've never been so scared," Sarah whispered as they walked through the hospital's sliding doors, her hand protectively cradling her belly. "Not even when you were deployed." Jake squeezed her hand, understanding completely. In Afghanistan, he'd faced danger head-on, but this, watching his wife and unborn child face a risky surgery, felt infinitely more terrifying. Atlas seemed to sense their anxiety. He pressed closer to Sarah's side, his movements so subtle that only Jake, with his years of working alongside the dog, noticed how deliberately the shepherd was matching his pace to Sarah's slightly unsteady steps. The dog's presence had already caused quite a stir in the hospital. News of his incredible early detection had spread through the medical community like wildfire. As they approached the pre-op area, they were greeted by Dr. Rodriguez, the fetal surgery specialist who had flown in specifically for this case. Her eyes immediately went to Atlas, and despite the seriousness of the situation, she couldn't hide her amazement. "So this is our miracle dog," she said, kneeling down to Atlas's level. "You know, we've already had 3 medical journals request to document this case." Jake felt a surge of pride, but it was quickly overshadowed by concern as a nurse approached with admission papers. The statistics and risk factors listed on the consent forms made his throat tighten. A 60% success rate for the surgery, potential complications for both mother and baby, the possibility of early labor. His hand trembled slightly as he signed his name. Atlas whined softly and pressed against his leg, performing his trained response to Jake's anxiety. The simple action grounded him, just as it had countless times before. Sarah noticed and reached over to squeeze his hand. "Hey," she said softly, "if Atlas isn't worried, we shouldn't be either, right?" It was true. Since the diagnosis and surgery scheduling, Atlas's desperate behavior had changed. He remained attentive and protective, but the frantic energy had disappeared, replaced by his usual calm vigilance. Jake clung to this observation like a lifeline. The pre-op room was a flurry of activity as nurses hooked Sarah up to various monitors. Atlas sat perfectly still beside her bed, his eyes tracking every movement of the medical staff with intelligent attention. Dr. Rodriguez explained each step of the procedure one final time, using terms like minimally invasive and targeted approach, but Jake found himself focusing instead on the steady rise and fall of Atlas's breathing, using it to pace his own. Finally, it was time. A nurse approached with an apologetic look, explaining that Atlas would need to leave. Jake felt Sarah's grip on his hand tighten. Before he could respond, Dr. Thompson, who had insisted on being present for the surgery, stepped forward. "Let him stay just a few more minutes," she requested, then turned to Jake. "I've been reviewing research about the chemical markers dogs can detect. Atlas's abilities could provide valuable data for the surgery team. Would you be willing to let us observe his reactions for a moment longer?" Jake nodded, and they watched as Atlas did something remarkable. The dog walked to the left side of Sarah's belly, nose twitching, then deliberately placed his paw in a specific spot. Dr. Rodriguez's eyes widened. That's exactly where we plan to make the initial incision, the optimal entry point for reaching the tumor." The room fell silent. Atlas maintained his position, then slowly turned his head to look directly at Dr. Rodriguez, as if passing on his sacred duty of protection. The surgeon later would swear she'd never felt more evaluated in her entire career than in that moment under the shepherd's intense gaze. "I think Dr. Thompson said softly. Atlas has just given us his surgical approval. Sarah laughed through her tears, reaching down to stroke Atlas's head one last time. Take care of Jake for me, boy, she whispered. Atlas licked her hand gently, then turned to Jake, ready to perform his other crucial duty, keeping his humans steady through the long hours ahead. As they walked out of the pre-op area, Jake glanced back to see Dr. Rodriguez marking the spot Atlas had indicated on Sarah's belly. The surgeon's hands moved with newfound confidence, as if she'd received guidance from an unlikely but absolutely trusted colleague. The wait would be excruciating. Nearly 6 hours of surgery lay ahead. But as Jake settled into the private waiting room the hospital had provided, Atlas's warm weight against his leg and steady presence beside him, he felt a glimmer of hope. His mind drifted back to Afghanistan, to all the times Atlas had led him safely through danger, and he knew with unshakable certainty that his dog had led them to exactly where they needed to be, into the hands of doctors who were about to perform a miracle, guided by the wisdom of an extraordinary service dog who had once again proved that some angels wore fur instead of wings. The waiting room clock seemed to move in slow motion as Jake counted each passing minute. Atlas hadn't left his side, maintaining a constant vigil that reminded Jake of their nights on patrol in Afghanistan. Every time Jake's leg would start bouncing with anxiety, Atlas would press against him, grounding him back to the present moment, away from the spiraling thoughts of what could go wrong. Dr. Thompson stopped by regularly, providing updates that seemed encouraging, but were wrapped in careful medical terminology. The tumor's position is exactly where Atlas indicated, she reported during her third visit. Dr. Rodriguez said she's never had such precise pre-surgical mapping. She's calling him the canine CT scan. 4 hours into the surgery, Jake watched as various medical students and researchers quietly filtered into the waiting room, their whispered conversations punctuated with phrases like unprecedented and groundbreaking case. Atlas paid them no attention, his focus solely on Jake, but his ears perked up every time the operating room doors swung open. Jake's phone buzzed constantly with messages from his Marine buddies. Word had spread through the veteran community about Atlas's latest miracle, and the support poured in. His former commanding officer even called, reminiscing about the time Atlas had detected an IED that their best equipment had missed. That dog's got something special, Martinez, he said gruffly. If he says your baby's going to be fine, you can bet your life on it. 5 hours in, Jake found himself talking to Atlas, his voice low enough that only the dog could hear. You remember that night in Kandahar? He whispered, scratching behind Atlas's ears. When you wouldn't let me go down that alley and we found out later there was an ambush waiting? You've always known, haven't you? Always seen what we couldn't see. Atlas looked up at him with those intelligent eyes, and Jake felt some of his fear melt away. The 6th hour brought an unexpected visitor, the hospital's chief of surgery. He sat down next to Jake, his eyes fixed on Atlas with undisguised amazement. I've been in medicine for 30 years, he said, shaking his head, and I've never seen anything like this. We're already designing a study to research how dogs might be used in early detection of fetal abnormalities. Your Atlas might have just revolutionized prenatal care. Jake nodded, pride mixing with his anxiety. Atlas had always been extraordinary, but this went beyond anything he could have imagined when he was first paired with the dog. Back then, he'd been a broken soldier, haunted by the horrors of war, barely able to leave his house. Now Atlas wasn't just his savior, he was potentially paving the way to save countless other babies. Just as Jake's watch marked the 6.5-hour mark, Atlas suddenly sat up straight, his tail wagging slowly. Seconds later, Dr. Rodriguez appeared in the waiting room, still in her surgical scrubs, her face tired but wearing a broad smile. Before she could speak, Atlas let out a soft, happy whine, a sound Jake hadn't heard since before he'd started detecting Sarah's condition. The surgery was successful, Dr. Rodriguez announced, her voice filled with emotion. We removed the entire tumor, and both Sarah and the baby are doing wonderfully. The precision of the tumor's location, exactly where Atlas indicated, allowed us to use a minimally invasive approach that significantly reduced the risks. Jake felt his legs go weak with relief, and he dropped to his knees, wrapping his arms around Atlas. The dog licked his face as Jake's tears fell freely, no longer caring about maintaining his tough marine exterior. Around them, the gathered medical staff broke into spontaneous applause. Dr. Rodriguez knelt beside them, her eyes shining. Sarah's in recovery and she's already asking for both of you. And Jake, she paused, placing a hand on his shoulder. The baby's heartbeat is strong and perfect. Atlas was right all along. We got to it just in time. As they walked to the recovery room, Jake noticed how Atlas's whole demeanor had changed. The tension he'd carried for weeks had disappeared, replaced by the quiet confidence Jake remembered from their days in service. Hospital staff stopped in the hallways, pointing and whispering, some wiping away tears as they watched the Marine and his miraculous dog pass by. Sarah was groggy but awake when they entered her room, her hands immediately reaching for both Jake and Atlas. The dog gently rested his head on the edge of her bed, his eyes soft and peaceful as he gazed at her belly, now bandaged but healing. The fetal monitor beeped steadily in the background, each sound a reminder of the life they'd managed to protect. Thanks to an extraordinary dog who had once again proven that his devotion knew no bounds. As Jake watched his wife drift off to sleep, Atlas settling into his guard position beside her bed, he realized that some miracles didn't need wings or halos. Sometimes they came with 4 paws, a wet nose, and a heart big enough to save not just one life, but an entire family's future. 6 months later, Jake stood in the freshly painted nursery, watching Atlas inspect every corner of the room for the 3rd time that day. The dog's thorough safety checks had become a daily routine as they prepared for the baby's arrival, and Jake couldn't help but smile at his partner's dedication. The walls were decorated with a mural of mountains and stars, a tribute to those nights in Afghanistan when Atlas had kept watch while Jake slept under similar skies. "He's at it again?" Sarah asked from the doorway, her hand resting on her now prominent belly. She looked radiant, all traces of the surgery gone, except for a small scar that Dr. Rodriguez had declared precision perfect thanks to our canine surgical consultant. The story of Atlas's extraordinary detection had spread far beyond their small community. Medical journals had published papers about the case, and research teams across the country had launched studies into the potential of using specially trained dogs for early detection of fetal abnormalities. Dr. Thompson had even started a pilot program at the university hospital, working with service dog organizations to train a new generation of prenatal detection dogs. "You know what today is?" Jake asked, pulling Sarah close as Atlas finished his inspection and sat contentedly at their feet. "1 year ago exactly, Atlas started acting strange around you. We had no idea then that he was about to change everything." Sarah nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. "I was thinking about that this morning. Remember how scared we were? Now look at us." She reached down to stroke Atlas's head. "Thanks to this amazing boy, we're going to meet our daughter soon." The aftermath of Atlas's miraculous detection had brought unexpected changes to their lives. Jake had been asked to speak at veterinary conferences and medical schools, sharing their story and advocating for the expansion of service dog programs. Atlas had received numerous awards, including a special commendation from the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, a first for a canine. But more meaningful than any award were the letters that arrived almost daily from parents around the world, sharing their own stories of pregnancy complications and hoping that someday, dogs like Atlas might help other families avoid tragedy. Jake kept every letter in a special box, planning to share them with his daughter someday so she would understand the full impact of the dog who had saved her life before she was born. As if sensing their reminiscence, Atlas stood and gently pressed his nose against Sarah's belly, a gesture that no longer brought anxiety, but instead filled them with joy. The baby kicked in response, and Atlas's tail wagged happily. "Dr. Rodriguez called yesterday," Sarah said, lowering herself into the rocking chair while Atlas settled at her feet. "She said the latest scans are perfect. No sign the tumor will ever recur, and our little girl's heart is as strong as can be." She smiled down at Atlas. She also said 3 other hospitals have started their own dog training programs based on Atlas's success. "Can you believe it? Our boy is changing the future of prenatal care." Jake knelt beside them, overwhelmed by gratitude. Atlas had saved his life and sanity after the war, given him the strength to build a new life with Sarah. and now had ensured their daughter would enter the world healthy and strong. But beyond their personal miracle, he had opened new doors in medicine that would help countless other families. You know what else came today? Jake reached into his pocket and pulled out a small envelope. The approval for Atlas's official therapy dog certification. Once the baby's here and things settle down, he can start visiting the prenatal unit at the hospital. Dr. Thompson says just his presence gives hope to worried parents. Sarah wiped away tears as Atlas stood, moving to press against Jake's leg, his eternal gesture of support and love. Through the nursery window, the setting sun painted the room in shades of gold, catching the silver in Atlas's muzzle. He was older now, but his eyes remained as bright and alert as the day Jake had first met him at the training center. The baby kicked again, and Atlas's ears perked up, his gaze soft but vigilant. Jake thought about all the miracles this extraordinary dog had brought into their lives, how he had transformed from a military service dog to a life-saving medical pioneer, while never wavering in his devotion to his family. You know, Sarah said softly, watching Atlas settle into his guard position between the rocking chair and the crib, we still haven't decided on a middle name for her. She looked up at Jake meaningfully. How does hope sound? Because that's what Atlas gave us when we needed it most. Jake felt his throat tighten with emotion as he watched his wife and his dog, his two great loves, bathed in the warm light of sunset. In a few weeks, their daughter would complete their family, her very presence a testament to the extraordinary bond between humans and dogs, and the miracles that could unfold when you trusted a dog's heart to guide you through the darkness. Atlas looked up at them, his expression serene and satisfied, as if he had known all along that everything would turn out exactly as it should. And really, Jake thought, maybe he had. After all, Atlas had never been wrong before, and the life growing strong and healthy in Sarah's belly was living proof that some of life's greatest guardians walked on four legs, saw with their hearts, and loved without limits.